The auctioneer hammered the gavel down at $330 on a sharp, clear October morning in 2005 at the Park County Equipment Auction outside Livingston, Montana. And the man in the rust-red polyester western blazer, standing under the orange canvas tent, let out a long, flat laugh that carried across the gravel lot and turned the heads of every ranch hand bidding on the round bale movers. Bartholomew Drysdale was 50 years old, 6 foot, lean and rangy, his silver hair slicked straight back from a high forehead and held in place with thick pomade. A thick silver mustache curled at the ends in regulation oil-field man style. Sharp pale gray eyes with a glint of fluorescent dealership flicker behind them, deeply tanned face from a lifetime of standing in a Livingston used truck lot off Interstate 90. He wore a rust-red polyester western-cut blazer with white piping along the yoke over a cream-colored snap-front western shirt, dark gray wool slacks, polished cognac-brown cowboy boots stitched in black, a wide tooled leather belt with a heavy nickel-silver longhorn buckle, and a tall cream-colored Stetson Stallion 4X cowboy hat pushed back on his head. A pewter bolo tie set with a turquoise cabochon hung at his throat, and a thick gold ring set with another turquoise sat on his left pinky. He ran Drysdale Diesel sales out of a gravel lot west of Livingston, with 20 late-model Freightliners and a hand-painted billboard that read, "Trust the Hat." The 1968 Kenworth W900 conventional cab wrecker at the back of the auction yard had been the last lot of the morning, and Bart Drysdale had told the auctioneer privately he would not have offered $10 for it because the cab roof was holed through with rust. The 24-year-old salvage mechanic at the back of the bidder's row had just outbid him for $330 against his casual $60 opening shot, and Bart was making sure the Park County ranchers understood the joke. Asher Ridenour folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his lined canvas chore coat and walked through the gravel toward the back of the lot. The Kenworth was 24 feet of long-nose conventional cab heavy iron. The cab painted a faded Montana maroon, oxidized to a chalky, dusty rose along the body panels, and bone white along the upper edges of the doors and the cab roof. The chrome Kenworth lettering across the front of the long hood tarnished to a dull pewter. The dual-stack chrome exhaust pipes blackened with old soot. The chrome side cab mirrors snapped off at the brackets. A Holmes 850 wrecker boom mounted on the rear deck, listing 2 degrees right, with both cables frayed and rusted. The wooden cargo deck planks rotted, and the word "junk" spray-painted in flaking yellow block letters across the driver's door. A hole the size of a man's fist had rusted through the cab roof above the windshield, and rain had been falling through it for 19 winters. Asher had grown up on a Ridenour ranch 6 miles south of where this truck had last been parked. His grandfather, Magnus Ridenour, was waiting at the trailer. Magnus was 76 years old, a retired Great Northern Railway section foreman who had spent 41 years walking the line between Livingston and Glasgow. 5'10", lean and erect, with broad, bony shoulders and the kind of stoop that comes from 40 years of bending over track ties. Snow-white hair clipped close, a thick salt and pepper mustache trimmed long at the ends, deep-set steel-gray eyes with crow's feet at the corners, deeply tanned face permanently lined by Montana wind, large knotted hands, a blackthorn walking stick with a brass cap leaned against his hip. He wore a heavy oilskin chore coat, the color of dry sage over a faded blue chambray work shirt, buttoned to the throat. Dark gray, heavy twill work pants held up with brown leather suspenders, scuffed brown leather riding boots, and a battered dark gray wool fedora with a worn brown leather hat band and a single small horsehair feather tucked into the band. A meerschaum pipe, stained the color of weak coffee, sat unlit between his teeth. Magnus set his free hand on the rusty fender of the Kenworth and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Cyrus Renfrew's old W900. Cyrus Renfrew had run Renfrew Heavy Recovery out of a cinder-block shop on Park Street in Livingston for 15 years, pulling stuck cattle haulers and overturned hay wagons out of the Yellowstone Valley and the Paradise Valley, hauling crippled semis off the 7% grade of Beartooth Pass, working every storm from October through April. He had built the Holmes 850 wrecker boom onto the rear deck of the W900 himself in 1971 with the help of 2 brakemen from Magnus's railroad crew. He had married a Bozeman girl named Helen Mossberg in 1968, and they had a daughter, Iris, born in 1972. Cyrus had died in November of 1986. He had been on a cattle hauler recovery on the top of Beartooth Pass in an early-season blizzard when a downhill semi crossed the center line above him on Switchback Number 5 and clipped his wrecker. The W900 had slid off the shoulder and rolled twice down a snowbank draw and landed upright 120 feet below the road, with Cyrus still belted into the driver's seat, alive but unresponsive. He died at the trauma center in Billings 2 days later of his head injuries. He was 54 years old. Iris was 14. The W900 had been recovered, towed home by another wrecker out of Big Timber, and parked behind Renfrew Heavy Recovery's cinderblock shop. Helen had paid the property tax on the lot for 19 years until she remarried in 2004 and moved to Bozeman to be close to her daughter. The lot had been sold to a Livingston developer, and the Kenworth had been consigned to the spring auction. Asher had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a brakeman in Glasgow that Cyrus Renfrew's truck was being sold. They winched the W900 onto Asher's flatbed trailer that afternoon. Bart Drysdale stood at the rear of his polished black GMC dually and watched, his tall cream-colored Stetson pushed back, and as Asher pulled out, he called across the lot that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, Drysdale Diesel Sales would put him in a 1996 International for $200 a month. Asher did not answer. Magnus climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 18 miles north on US 89 to Magnus's railroad tie barn outside Wilsall, the dead W900 rocking behind them, the Holmes 850 booms pointing at the long, pale October Montana sky like 2 crooked fingers. The restoration would take 19 years. Nobody knew that on the drive home. Asher worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Bozeman during the week, and he drove the hour north up US 89 to Magnus's barn every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the cab roof because the rust would not wait. They cut out the rusted-through panel above the windshield and welded in fresh 20-gauge sheet and primed the inside. They pulled the Cummins NTC3 50 14-liter diesel out of the truck on a chain hoist and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were corroded, but salvageable. The crank was true, the head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 13-speed Road Ranger and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long Montana winter went into the engine and into stories about Cyrus Renfrew. Magnus told Asher about the night in 1978 when Cyrus had pulled a stuck Madison County cattle truck out of a flash-flooded creek bed at 3 in the morning and refused payment, except for a wheel of cured pepperjack. He told Asher about the morning in 1982 when Cyrus had hauled a jackknifed Peterbilt off the Beartooth in a January whiteout and let the contractor pay him in elk steaks for the winter. He told stories about Helen Renfrew's huckleberry pie. The second year, they sandblasted the frame, and the third year, the cab came off. By the fifth year, Magnus slowed. He had a quiet stroke in February that put him in the Bozeman hospital for 14 days. He came home leaning more heavily on the blackthorn walking stick, but his hands still worked. He told Asher the truck would wait. By the 8th year, the Kenworth was a roller. By the 11th year, Asher's daughter was born, and the work paused for a month. In the 15th year, they painted the cab. They wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy Montana maroon that matched a faded snapshot Magnus had of the truck from 1976. And they masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking yellow junk paint still showed through, and they left it there. Asher did not know why. He just left it. By the 17th year, the Holmes 850 booms were rebuilt with fresh aircraft-grade cables and freshly painted flat black. Through all of it, Bart Drysdale drove past the foot of Magnus's gravel drive on US 89, sometimes on his way to a Bozeman dealer trade. The polished black GMC duly slowing on the highway, the tall cream Stetson visible through the windshield, and the truck never quite stopped, but never quite passed at full speed either. By the 19th year, the Kenworth was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the Cummins for a final head gasket refresh. The engine work was the last thing on the list, because Magnus always said you start with what makes the truck move, and you finish with one more pass to make sure she will start in 20 below. On a cold, clear morning of November, the 2nd of the 19th year, Asher pulled into Magnus's railroad tie barn with a fresh head gasket and a torque wrench. He was 43 years old. The dark brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small scar across his left jaw from an engine hoist chain in 2013 was a faint white line, and his hands had the heavy thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Magnus was 95. He sat on his folding wooden chair by the wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees, the battered dark gray wool fedora pulled low against the barn cold, the meerschaum pipe still between his teeth, the blackthorn walking stick laid across his lap. Asher pulled the Cummins out of the W900 with the chain hoist. He set the long 14-liter block on the engine stand. He started to unbolt the head, and he stopped. There was something taped flat to the back face of the engine block in the bell housing void where the engine met the bell housing flange. He could see the corner of it now that the engine was clear of the chassis and rotated on the stand. He set down the wrench. He reached up and worked the corner free with his fingertips. Bound to the back face of the block with 3 wraps of black electrical tape, weatherproof, untouched for 19 years, was a small flat oilcloth pouch wrapped in waxed butcher paper. He carried it to the workbench under the clip-on lamp. He cut the electrical tape and unwrapped the waxed paper and unfolded the oilcloth, 2 layers deep. Inside were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 90 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper that he would count on the bench at $1,800. There was a heavy brass railroad pocket watch on a tarnished steel chain, the dial reading Great Northern Railway across the bottom of the face above a tiny enameled mountain goat emblem. The inside of the back case engraved with 3 small initials and the words, Section Foreman, 1923. There was a small color photograph mounted on stiff card showing a small girl of about 5 in a brown corduroy jumper, standing in front of the Kenworth W900 with the Holmes 8.5 old boom behind her, the cab gleaming in maroon and chrome, the date August 1977 written on the back in pencil. And there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded but legible. Asher unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated November the 6th of 1986. It read, To Iris, the cash is for whatever a man's daughter needs cash for at 18. The watch is your grandfather Wendell's. He carried it on the section line from 1923 until he retired in 1968. He gave it to me when I turned 18. The photograph is of you the morning I taught you to climb up on the boom. I am taping these to the back of the engine block because I do not want them lost if anything happens to me on the Beartooth this winter. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Cyrus Wendell Renfrew, Livingston, Montana, November 6, 1986. Asher sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Magnus held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. Magnus said quietly, Cyrus wrote this 7 days before the cattle hauler clipped him on the Beartooth. The girl never knew. They drove south to Bozeman the next Saturday. Magnus had called a brakeman he had known in Glasgow whose wife worked at a Bozeman veterinary practice, and the brakeman had given them a current address on an acreage on Sourdough Road southeast of town. They drove down US 89 under a clear blue Montana sky and pulled into a long gravel drive past white rail horse fencing and parked in front of a barnwood-sided ranch office with a hand-painted sign that read, Sourdough Large Animal Veterinary. The woman who came out wiping her hands on a green coverall was 52 years old. She had Cyrus Renfrew's heavy shoulders and her father's steady gray eyes. She wore a faded green canvas coverall over a dark blue thermal undershirt, brown leather Blundstone boots, and a small silver mountain goat pendant on a leather cord at her throat. Magnus spoke first. He said, Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his Kenworth in my barn in 1981. My grandson here bought the W900 at the spring auction in Livingston 19 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something behind her engine block that belongs to you. Iris's face changed. She invited them into a small ranch office kitchen, and they sat at a round oak table, and Asher set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the watch, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Iris picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time, and her eyes filled. She said the small silver mountain goat pendant she had been wearing every day for 20 years was the only thing she had that her father had touched. She had never seen the photograph. She had not known her grandfather Wendell had owned a pocket watch. She picked up the watch, and she turned it slowly between her fingers and read the inscription on the inside back case. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her north to Wilsall the next morning. Iris stood in the open bay of Magnus's barn and walked slowly around the Kenworth 3 times. She ran her hand along the chrome Kenworth lettering. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking yellow junk was still masked in blue tape. She turned to Asher and she asked the price. Asher looked at his grandfather. Magnus laid his blackthorn walking stick across his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone. And then we are going to drive her down to Park Street in Livingston and park her at the empty corner where Renfrew Heavy Recovery cinder block shop stood until the developer tore it down in 1999. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in the same white block letters he had on her in 1971. The boy paid $330 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you." They finished the Kenworth through that winter. Iris drove up from Bozeman every other Sunday. On the morning of May the 4th of the 20th year, they rolled the W900 out of Magnus's barn under a clear blue Montana sky, and they drove her in convoy south on US 89 down to the corner of Park Street in Livingston, where Renfrew Heavy Recovery had run her shop until November of 1986. They parked her facing the street. Asher handed Iris a small can of deep maroon paint and a 1-inch brush. Iris climbed up on the running board, and she painted out the flaking yellow junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, "Renfrew Heavy Recovery. Established, 1971, old enough to drive her without breaking her." She stepped down. A polished black GMC duly went by on Park Street. Bart Drysdale was driving, the tall cream Stetson pushed back. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Kenworth at the corner with the maroon door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel, and he did not laugh. He drove on. The Kenworth sits at the corner of Park Street in Livingston today, and the sign on the door reads, "Renfrew Heavy Recovery, established 1971. Iris runs the large animal practice outside Bozeman. The $1,800 sits in a small lockbox at her ranch office. The Great Northern Railway pocket watch sits on the desk beside it. The 1977 photograph is framed above her kitchen table. The letter is in a small fireproof box in her closet. She reads it once a year, on the 6th of November. If you ever see an old Kenworth W900 parked at a Montana street corner with the words "Renfrew Heavy Recovery" painted on the door in clean white, slow down. Roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a salesman in a turquoise pinky ring would not have offered $10 for, and the work was always for the girl. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.